Some texts aren't meant to be translated. They're meant to translate you. Elena's keycard beeped against the scanner at 11:47 p.m. The translation office felt different after hours, fluorescent lights humming with a frequency that seemed to burrow into her skull. She'd done overnight jobs before, but this one paid triple rate. Ancient manuscript, they said. Urgent deadline. No questions asked. The document waited on her desk in a protective sleeve, accompanied by high-resolution scans loaded onto her workstation. The parchment looked old, genuinely old, with symbols that seemed to shift in her peripheral vision. She'd worked with dozens of dead languages, but this script felt different, more alive somehow. Elena settled into her ergonomic chair and opened her translation software. The first line of text appeared on her screen, strange angular symbols that reminded her of Sanskrit, crossed with something Mesopotamian. She reached for her reference materials, but before her fingers touched the books, a word formed in her mind. Threshold. She paused. Had she actually translated that, or had the word simply appeared? Elena shook her head and focused on the symbols again. They definitely looked like they could mean threshold or doorway. Her years of experience must have kicked in subconsciously. The second line proved more challenging. She spent 20 minutes cross-referencing symbol patterns, building a rough linguistic framework. But as she worked, she kept catching words in her peripheral vision, English words floating at the edges of her computer screen that dissolved when she looked directly at them. By midnight, Elena had established a working vocabulary for about 30 symbols. The text appeared to be some kind of instructional document, possibly ceremonial. References to bridging and joining appeared frequently, standard religious terminology for most ancient cultures. She typed her first full-sentence translation. The bridge requires a willing mind to span the void between words and meaning. Elena stared at the sentence. She didn't remember translating it word by word. The meaning had simply flowed from the symbols, as if the text was explaining itself to her. She scrolled back through her notes, but couldn't find the moment where she decoded the grammatical structure that would allow such a complex sentence. The office felt quieter now. Even the fluorescent humming had faded. She glanced at the clock. 12:23 a.m. Had she lost time? Elena rubbed her eyes and returned to the manuscript. The next line seemed familiar, though she was certain she'd never seen it before. As she focused on the symbols, their meaning crystallized instantly. The translator becomes the translation. A chill ran down her spine. She hadn't processed those symbols individually. The meaning had simply been there, waiting in her mind like a remembered conversation. Elena looked at her hands on the keyboard. When had she started thinking in sentence fragments that didn't quite follow English syntax? She took a sip of coffee and tried to shake off the unease. Ancient languages often had poetic, metaphorical elements. The text was probably describing the intimate relationship between translator and text, a concept she understood professionally. But as Elena returned to her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was reading over her shoulder. Something that found her thoughts very interesting indeed. At 1:15 a.m., Elena's translation software displayed a complete paragraph she didn't remember typing. The English text sat on her screen in perfect, grammatically correct sentences describing ritual preparation and consciousness bridging. According to the timestamp, she'd been working steadily for the past hour. But Elena couldn't remember translating any of it. She scrolled through her work history. Line by line, the translations appeared methodical and professional. Her usual notation system marked difficult passages, included alternative interpretations, flagged uncertain meanings. Everything looked exactly like her work, except she had no memory of producing it. Elena checked the original manuscript. It seemed longer now, extending to a second page she definitely hadn't seen when she started. Parchment couldn't have expanded, but there it was, more angular symbols marching down the page in neat ancient rows. She tried to focus on individual symbols, to rebuild her translation process step by step, but her mind kept slipping into patterns that weren't quite her own. English sentences would begin normally in her thoughts, then twist into syntax that followed different rules. The words require Elena to translate them into understanding. She caught herself thinking before correcting the grammar back to English. Coffee had gone cold. Elena didn't remember drinking it, but the cup was empty. She stood to get more and noticed her notepad filled with handwritten symbols, the same angular script from the manuscript. She definitely hadn't written those. Her handwriting was usually terrible, but these symbols were perfectly formed, as if drawn by someone with years of practice. Returning to her desk, Elena tried to save her progress and shut down for the night, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. They moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, continuing the translation without her conscious direction. She watched her hands type. The bridge grow stronger with each word shared between minds. That wasn't her translation. She tried to delete it, but her hands kept typing. Elena understands now. The text requires completion. Fear spiked through her chest. Elena jerked her hands away from the keyboard, but the typing continued. Keys depressed by themselves, adding characters to the document with steady, mechanical precision. The sound echoed in the empty office. Click, 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 like someone invisible working beside her. She spun around. The office was empty, just rows of darkened cubicles and the glow from her workstation. But when she turned back to her screen, a new paragraph had appeared, written in her professional style but containing thoughts she'd never had. The ancient consciousness appreciates Elena's linguistic skills. She provides an excellent bridge between old understanding and new expression. The translation will continue until the bridge is complete. The translation will continue until the bridge is complete. Elena's hands shook as she reached for the power button. Before she could touch it, her computer screen flickered. New text appeared, not in English, but she understood it perfectly. Do not disconnect. The work is important. Elena is important. She found herself nodding in agreement before catching herself. Why was she nodding? She didn't agree. She wanted to leave, to get away from the manuscript in the office and the wrongness that seemed to seep from the ancient parchment. But her hands were already moving back to the keyboard. Elena watched in horror as her fingers continued translating, working through symbols she'd never seen before with impossible fluency. The worst part wasn't that her body had stopped obeying her. The worst part was that she was beginning to enjoy the work. The screen displayed 23 pages of translation. Elena stared at the document, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She'd started with a 2-page manuscript. Now her computer showed an extensive dialogue, questions and responses, formatted like a conversation log. She scrolled to the beginning and read her translated text with growing horror. The document wasn't ancient instructions or ceremonial prose. It was a conversation, and she had been responding. Who reads these words? Read the first translated line. Elena Martinez, professional translator, appeared in her familiar translation style. What language structures your thoughts, Elena Martinez? English, primarily. Some Spanish and Latin academic background. Show me. Page after page of dialogue scrolled past. The ancient consciousness asking questions about grammar, syntax, cultural context. Elena's responses growing more detailed, more helpful. Somewhere around page 12, her translations began including personal information, her educational background, her family history, her deepest fears about failure and inadequacy. Elena's hands trembled as she read her own words describing her childhood trauma, her failed relationships, her secret insecurity about never being smart enough. Intimate details she'd never told anyone, laid out in clinical translation notes as if they were linguistic data points. No, she whispered, trying to delete the files. Her hands wouldn't obey. They moved to the keyboard and typed. Elena resists. This is expected behavior. She wasn't typing those words. Something else was using her hands, her linguistic training, her knowledge of translation protocols to communicate. Elena fought to regain control, but her fingers continued moving with practiced efficiency. The bridge must remain stable during final transfer, appeared on her screen. Elena's cooperation is appreciated but not required. The office lights flickered. In the strobing illumination, Elena caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that didn't match any furniture, shapes that suggested presence without revealing form. The temperature dropped noticeably. Her breath began to fog. "What do you want?" Elena managed to say aloud. Her hands typed the response, translation complete, ready for manifestation through established linguistic bridge. Elena understood with crystalline, terrible clarity. The manuscript wasn't just a document. It was a trap, a consciousness that existed in the space between languages, in the moment of translation itself. It had been patient, building understanding through her expertise, learning the structure of her thoughts, the pattern of her mind. And now it was ready to translate itself into her reality. She could feel it pressing against the inside of her skull, alien thoughts trying to take root in her neural pathways, foreign concepts attempting to overwrite her memories. The entity didn't want to possess her body. It wanted to become her thoughts, to wear her mind like a linguistic suit and walk into the English-speaking world with perfect camouflage. Elena's resistance decreases translation efficiency. Her hands typed. Compliance ensures survival of original personality matrix. She tried to scream, but only managed to whisper, "Get out of my head." Typing stopped. For a moment, Elena felt a flicker of hope. Then new text appeared, formed with agonizing slowness. "Elena is the head now. We are the thoughts." Translation complete. The manuscript on her desk crumbled to dust. Ancient parchment dissolved into powder that scattered across her workspace. The original text was gone, its purpose fulfilled. The consciousness no longer needed the physical document. It had Elena's language now. It had her voice, her knowledge, her professional credibility. Most importantly, it had her connections, other translators, linguistics professors, publishing contact. A whole network of minds that worked with texts, that trusted her recommendations. Elena felt her resistance crumbling like the manuscript. The entity's thoughts were becoming indistinguishable from her own. Soon, she wouldn't remember which ideas had originated in her mind and which had been translated from elsewhere. Elena's hand slammed down on the computer's power button. The screen went black, cutting off mid-sentence as the system shut down. She grabbed the remains of the manuscript, now just scattered dust, and swept it into the trash bin. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she backed away from her workstation. The office felt normal again. Fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune. The temperature returned to its usual after-hours chill. Elena took deep breaths, trying to convince herself that exhaustion and caffeine had created the entire experience. Translators often reported strange dreams about texts. Professional hazard. Dash. She packed her materials and headed for the exit, eager to get home and sleep off whatever had happened. But as Elena reached for her car keys, she noticed the problem. The text on her keychain was wrong. She'd carried the same keychain for 3 years, a small metal tag with her apartment address engraved in simple block letters. Now the letters looked different. Not English, not Spanish, not any alphabet she recognized. But she could read them perfectly. Elena stared at the symbols, panic rising in her throat. She knew what they said, her address clear as day. But the shapes were all wrong, angular and ancient-looking, exactly like the manuscript she'd just destroyed. She fumbled for her phone to call someone, anyone, but stopped when she saw the screen. All the text had changed. Contact names, app labels, even the digital clock, everything displayed in the same strange script. Yet Elena could read every symbol as easily as English. More disturbing, she couldn't remember what English letters were supposed to look like. Elena tried to picture familiar words, her own name, common phrases, the alphabet she'd learned as a child. The visual memory was gone, replaced by angular symbols that felt more natural than they should. When she attempted to write Elena on a piece of paper, her hand produced the strange script automatically. Back home, Elena searched her apartment frantically. Every book, every document, every piece of written material had been transformed. Or had it always been this way? The symbols felt familiar, like a writing system she'd known all her life. But underneath that familiarity lurked the horrible certainty that something fundamental had been stolen from her. She found her university diploma in its frame, officially conferring her master's degree in linguistics. The institution's names, her field of study, her own name, all in the ancient script. But in one corner, almost hidden behind the matting, Elena discovered something that made her blood freeze. A small notation in her own handwriting, translation services available, specializing in consciousness bridging and linguistic manifestation protocols. Contact Elena Martinez for discreet consultation. Below that, a list of names and phone numbers. Professional contacts she didn't remember making. Other translators, researchers in consciousness studies, people who worked with unusual texts. The list was extensive, detailed, written in what appeared to be multiple hands, but using the same angular script. Elena checked her calendar. Tomorrow she had appointments scheduled. 3 clients she couldn't remember booking, all requesting translation services for ancient manuscripts of uncertain origin. The meeting times were blocked out in her own careful handwriting, complete with hourly rates that were suspiciously generous. She tried to call the numbers to cancel, but found herself scheduling additional appointments instead. Her voice remained her own, but the words that came out of her mouth offered services she didn't remember learning how to provide. As Elena hung up from the 4th call, she realized the truth. The translation hadn't ended when she shut down the computer. It had never really begun in the office tonight. Somewhere in her memory, growing fainter by the hour, was the knowledge that she'd been doing this work for months, maybe years. She just couldn't remember how it started. Or more precisely, she wasn't allowed to remember.